March 20th, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. ***. The snow fell in silence. It was the kind of silence that swallows sound, thick, heavy, absolute. Across the frozen fields of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, the evergreen trees stood like sentinels draped in white, their branches bending under the weight of winter. The air tasted of pine and wood smoke. Inside the mess hall of Compound 7, 243 Japanese prisoners of war sat motionless on wooden benches, their eyes fixed forward, their hands folded in their laps. They had been told to assemble at 1800 hours. They had been told nothing else. It was the 17th of January, 1945. The war in the Pacific raged on, 6,000 miles away, but here in the American heartland, in the fading light of a winter afternoon, something else was about to begin. Something none of these men had prepared for. Something their officers had never warned them about. Something that would shake the foundations of everything they had been taught to believe about their enemy, about themselves, about the war they had been fighting. The doors at the far end of the hall swung open. Cold air rushed in, and with it came music. Not the martial drums of war, not the solemn hymns of duty, but something bright, lilting, filled with a joy so alien to these men that it took several seconds before they recognized it as music at all. An American military band, instruments gleaming under the electric lights, began to play. The melody was unfamiliar. The rhythm was strange. But the faces of the American soldiers standing along the walls, those faces were not the faces of conquerors. They were smiling. The prisoners did not understand. To comprehend what happened in that mess hall on that January evening, one must first understand what these men had expected to find when they became prisoners of the United States. One must understand the doctrine that had shaped them, the culture that had forged them, the lies they had been told. Since childhood, every soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army had been instructed in the principles of Bushido, the way of the warrior. But the Bushido of the 1940s was not the philosophical code of medieval samurai. It had been twisted, weaponized, transformed into a tool of the state. The Imperial Rescript to Soldiers and Sailors, issued in 1882 and drilled into every recruit, demanded absolute loyalty to the Emperor. It declared that death was preferable to the disgrace of surrender. Duty is weightier than a mountain, the Rescript proclaimed, while death is lighter than a feather. By 1944, this ideology had calcified into something darker. The Senjinkan, the field service code distributed to all Japanese military personnel, explicitly forbade surrender. Article 8 stated, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to avoid the ignominy of being captured." Soldiers were told that to surrender was to cease being Japanese. To become a prisoner was to become less than human. And what of the enemy? What had these soldiers been told about the Americans who would capture them? They had been told that Americans were barbarians, savages, a mongrel race corrupted by materialism and weakened by individualism. They had been told that American soldiers would torture prisoners, mutilate them, humiliate them in ways too terrible to name. Propaganda films showed American troops bayoneting wounded Japanese soldiers, laughing as they did so. Officers whispered stories of prisoners forced to dig their own graves, of men flayed alive, of unspeakable violations. "Better to die with a grenade clutched to your chest," they said, "than to fall into American hands." So when these men, wounded, starving, delirious with fever or driven mad by thirst, when they had finally surrendered on islands like Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, when they had raised their hands or stumbled out of caves with their arms up, they had done so believing they were already dead. They had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. They were no longer soldiers, no longer Japanese. They were kirai mono, abandoned things. ghosts walking in the world of the living. The transport ships that carried them to America crossed an ocean, but they crossed something else as well. They crossed from everything these men had known into a realm of absolute unknowing. Chained below deck, many wept. Some refused food, hoping to die before reaching whatever hell awaited them on American soil. A few attempted suicide, only to be stopped by guards who treated them with a gentleness they could not comprehend. When they arrived at camps like McCoy, like Clarinda, like Lordsburg, facilities scattered across the American interior, they found not torture chambers but barracks. Not executioners but doctors who treated their wounds, their dysentery, their malaria. Not starvation but meals. 3 meals a day. Every day. The cognitive dissonance was total. It was not merely confusion. It was the shattering of reality itself. The first weeks in the camps passed in a fog of disbelief. The prisoners moved through their days in silence, eating food they did not deserve, sleeping in beds that should not exist, watched over by guards who did not beat them. Some prisoners believed it was an elaborate deception, that the Americans were fattening them up for some purpose, that the cruelty would begin once they had been lulled into complacency. Others retreated into catatonia, unable to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been promised. Camp McCoy, set on 60,000 acres of Wisconsin woodland, housed over 3,000 prisoners by the winter of 1944. The camp had been constructed in haste, but it was solid. Heated barracks, electric lights, indoor plumbing. The prisoners wore uniforms with PW stenciled on the back. They were assigned to work details: forestry, agriculture, maintenance. They were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip. They were allowed to send and receive mail, though few had anyone to write to. And slowly, against all their training, against all their expectations, they began to realize something impossible. They were not going to be killed. This realization did not bring relief. Not at first. For men who had spent years preparing for death, who had accepted death as the only honorable outcome, survival itself was a form of damnation. They were horio, prisoners. The word itself was a curse. In Japan, their names would be stricken from family registers. Their relatives would hold funerals for them. They would be mourned as dead because, in the eyes of their nation, they were dead. But here, in this strange snow-covered wilderness, they continued to breathe, to eat, to wake each morning to the sound of reveille and the smell of coffee brewing in the mess hall. And this stubborn continuance of life became the first crack in the wall of their indoctrination. It was Chaplain William Harding who first proposed the idea. A Methodist minister from Iowa, Harding had volunteered for the Army Chaplain Corps in 1942, believing that even in war, especially in war, there must be room for grace. He had been assigned to Camp McCoy in the spring of 1944 and had spent months observing the Japanese prisoners with a mixture of pity and curiosity. He saw men who flinched at kindness, who responded to gentleness with suspicion, who seemed to carry an invisible weight that bowed their shoulders and dimmed their eyes. In early December, Harding approached Major Harold Stevens, the camp commandant, with an unusual request. Christmas was coming. The American soldiers would have a celebration. Decorations, special meals, gifts from home. Harding asked, "What about the prisoners?" Stevens was a career officer, pragmatic and unsentimental. His job was to maintain security and follow regulations. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be treated humanely, but it said nothing about Christmas parties. Still, Stevens was also a father of 3, and the idea of men spending Christmas in silence and cold troubled him in a way he did not fully understand. After a week of consideration, Stevens agreed. But he imposed conditions. The celebration would be modest. No alcohol. No unsupervised mixing with American personnel. And it would be presented as a cultural education, not a religious conversion. The prisoners would be told they were learning about American customs. Nothing more. Harding accepted the terms. He recruited volunteers from among the American soldiers, men who gave up their own Christmas packages, who wrapped gifts in whatever paper they could find, who spent their off-duty hours stringing lights and cutting evergreen branches. A sergeant from Minnesota built a makeshift Christmas tree from pine boughs and wire. A corporal from Georgia taught the camp band to play Silent Night. A private from New York, whose family owned a bakery, convinced the mess hall cooks to attempt something he called Christmas cookies. The preparations were made in secret. The prisoners were told only that there would be an assembly, a special meal, an announcement of new camp regulations, perhaps. They suspected nothing. And so, on the evening of January 17, 1945, because December 25th had come and gone before the approvals had been finalized, the prisoners of Compound 7 found themselves standing in the mess hall, staring at a sight that defied comprehension. The hall had been transformed. Evergreen garlands hung from the rafters. Paper snowflakes, cut by American soldiers with the careful precision of school children, dangled from strings. At the far end of the room stood the tree, 8 feet tall, decorated with popcorn strings and paper ornaments and crowned with a star fashioned from tin cans. Electric lights, the kind used for military operations, had been strung along the walls, casting a warm glow that softened the harsh angles of the industrial space. And beneath the tree, stacked in neat rows, were boxes. Hundreds of them. Each wrapped in brown paper or pages torn from magazines, tied with string, topped with makeshift bows. The prisoners stood frozen. Some had begun to tremble. Not from cold, the hall was heated, but from something else. Something for which they had no name. Major Stevens stepped forward. Through an interpreter, a Nisei soldier named Henry Takahashi, whose presence itself was a paradox these prisoners could not reconcile, Stevens spoke. "In America," he said, "we have a tradition. Every winter, on December 25th, we celebrate Christmas. It is a time when we remember what is good, when we share what we have, when we show kindness to others, even to strangers." The interpreter translated. The prisoners listened, their faces blank. "Today," Stevens continued, "we want to share this tradition with you. Not because you are required to accept it, not because we wish to change what you believe, but because while you are here, under our care, we want you to understand who we are." He paused. The only sound was the soft crackle of the wood stove in the corner. "Each of you will receive a gift. Merry Christmas." Stevens stepped back. The band began to play. What happened next would be described differently by different witnesses. The American soldiers who were present would later struggle to find words for it. The prisoners themselves, in the years after the war, would speak of it rarely, and when they did, their voices would drop to whispers. At first, no one moved. The music played, Jingle Bells, bright and incongruous, and the prisoners stood like statues. Then, slowly, one man stepped forward. He was young, perhaps 19, with a scar across his left cheek from shrapnel. He approached the tree, looked back at his companions, then picked up one of the boxes. He held it as if it might explode. An American soldier, grinning, gestured for him to open it. The young prisoner looked at the interpreter. Takahashi nodded. "It's okay," he said in Japanese. "It's yours." The prisoner's hands shook as he unwrapped the paper. Inside was a bar of soap, a toothbrush, a small mirror, a comb, a pair of wool socks, and at the bottom, wrapped in wax paper, 3 cookies, misshapen, dusted with sugar, still warm. The young prisoner stared at the contents. He lifted the cookies to his nose and inhaled. Then his face crumpled. He sank to his knees, clutching the box to his chest, and he wept. It was as if a dam had burst. All around the hall, prisoners began to move forward. They picked up boxes with hands that trembled. They unwrapped gifts with the reverence of men handling sacred relics. And as they saw what was inside, simple things, practical things, things chosen with care, they broke. Men who had not cried when their comrades died, who had not cried when they were captured, who had not cried through months of illness and despair, these men wept. They wept openly, uncontrollably, as if something long frozen inside them had finally thawed. Some fell to their knees. Others pressed their hands to their faces. A few clutched their gifts and rocked back and forth, sobbing like children. The American soldiers watched in stunned silence. Some had expected gratitude. A few had expected indifference. None had expected this outpouring of raw, naked anguish. Chaplain Harding stood with tears running down his own face. "God help us," he whispered. "What have they done to these men?" In the days that followed, the camp was transformed in ways no regulation could mandate and no order could achieve. The prisoners began to speak. Not much at first, just small questions, tentative words. They asked the interpreter about America, about Christmas, about why the soldiers had given them gifts. Takahashi, the Nisei interpreter, tried to explain. But how could he make them understand? How could he tell them that in America, a land they had been taught to despise, there existed a tradition of generosity so ingrained that even in the midst of war, even toward enemies, it expressed itself in cookies and soap and wool socks? Some prisoners refused to use their gifts, believing it would be a betrayal. They kept the items in their footlockers, untouched, as if they were museum pieces. Others used them immediately, as if afraid the gifts would be taken away, as if the kindness might evaporate if not seized at once. One prisoner, a former sergeant named Takashi Yamada, later wrote in a diary that was preserved by the camp authorities, "I do not understand the Americans. We were told they were beasts. But beasts do not give gifts. We were told they were weak. But it takes great strength to be kind to those who would kill you. I do not know what to believe any more." This uncertainty, this crumbling of certainty, was precisely what the American authorities had not anticipated. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment. But no one had considered that humane treatment, consistently applied, would become a weapon more powerful than any bullet. That decency, offered without condition, would corrode the very foundations of the ideology that had turned these men into instruments of war. The cookies became a symbol. It was a small thing. Flour, sugar, butter, baked by soldiers who had never met the men who would eat them. But to the prisoners, those cookies represented something incomprehensible. In Japan, food was scarce. Rations were measured in grams. Soldiers in the field subsisted on rice and miso, supplemented by whatever they could forage. The idea that Americans who were also at war, who were also sacrificing, would take their own supplies. Sugar was rationed in America, butter was precious, and use them to bake treats for enemy prisoners? It was madness. It was profligacy. It was a display of wealth and generosity so vast that it seemed almost obscene. But more than that, it was a display of something these men had been taught did not exist in the individualistic, materialistic West: compassion. One prisoner, in a letter discovered decades later, wrote, "They gave us cookies. Small, sweet, broken things. I ate mine slowly, trying to make it last. And I thought, if they can spare this for us, what do their own people have? If this is how they treat their enemies, how do they treat their friends? And I realized, we have been lied to about everything." This realization spread through the camp like a virus. Men began to question. They questioned the propaganda they had been fed. They questioned the orders they had followed. They questioned the necessity of the deaths they had caused and witnessed. and in questioning, they began to change. The camp library, which had been largely ignored, became crowded. Prisoners requested books in English, asking Takahashi to teach them the language. They wanted to read American newspapers, American magazines. They wanted to understand. Work details, which had been carried out with sullen obedience, became opportunities for interaction. Prisoners began to ask their guards about their families, their homes, their lives. And the guards, surprised and cautiously pleased, answered. By February, the camp had established a school. Classes in English, in American history, in civics. Attendance was voluntary. Nearly every prisoner enrolled. By March, a prisoner-run newsletter had been created. Written in Japanese, it featured articles about American culture, translations of American songs, and editorials grappling with the cognitive dissonance the men were experiencing. By April, the camp had a baseball team. The prisoners had watched their guards play, fascinated by the strange sport. When offered equipment and instruction, they accepted with an enthusiasm that startled everyone. Baseball became an obsession. It was, after all, a game of rules and honor and skill, values they understood. But it was also a game of joy, of camaraderie, of play. And in playing, they remembered something they had forgotten, that they were human. But the transformation was not universal. Some prisoners clung to the old ideology with the desperation of drowning men clutching wreckage. They refused gifts. They refused to learn English. They refused to participate in activities. They gathered in corners of the barracks and whispered about loyalty, about honor, about the shame of their continued existence. These men formed a faction. They called themselves the Kikaisha, those who will return. They insisted that Japan would win the war, that they would be liberated, that those who had accepted American kindness would be punished as traitors. They enforced their beliefs with violence. Prisoners who attended English classes were beaten. Those who played baseball were ostracized. A young man who admitted, in a moment of weakness, that he was grateful for his treatment was found dead in the latrine, his throat cut. Major Stevens cracked down. The leaders of the Kikaisha were identified and transferred to a maximum security facility. But the damage had been done. The camp was divided. And every prisoner was forced to choose, cling to the past or step into an uncertain future. For many, the choice was agonizing. To accept that the Americans were not monsters meant accepting that their own sacrifices, their own atrocities, had been predicated on a lie. It meant confronting the possibility that the war itself, the war that had consumed millions of lives, had been a monstrous error. It meant mourning not only for what they had lost, but for what they had done. And yet, for an increasing number of prisoners, the alternative, to continue believing the lies, became impossible. The evidence was too overwhelming. The kindness too consistent. The contrast too stark. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Hiroshi Nakamura, later wrote, "Every day I expected the mask to fall. I expected the Americans to reveal their true nature. But the mask never fell. Because it was not a mask. This was who they were. And I realized the mask was what I had been wearing. The mask was what Japan had forced onto my face. And now, slowly, painfully, I was learning to remove it." Christmas 1945 was different. By then, the war was over. Japan had surrendered. The prisoners at Camp McCoy were no longer enemies, but neither were they free. They were caught in limbo, waiting for repatriation to a homeland many feared would not recognize them. This time, when Chaplain Harding proposed a Christmas celebration, there was no hesitation. The prisoners themselves volunteered to help. They made decorations from scrap paper and tin. They formed a choir and practiced American Christmas carols, singing in halting English. They organized a play, a retelling of the nativity story, performed in Japanese, with costumes sewn from blankets. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall was packed. American soldiers sat alongside Japanese prisoners. The barriers had not vanished, but they had softened. When the choir sang Silent Night, first in English and then in Japanese, *Kyo Sure, Ko no Yoru *, there was not a dry eye in the room. After the singing, Major Stevens stood. He was being transferred, reassigned to occupation duty in Japan. This would be his last night at McCoy. Through Takahashi, he spoke. "A year ago," he said, "we gave you gifts. We did it because it is our tradition. Because we believe that even in darkness, we must look for light. Because we believe that our enemies are not monsters, but men. Men who can change. Men who can choose." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "Many of you will return to Japan soon. You will return to a country that has been defeated, a country that must be rebuilt. And I hope, I pray, that you will take with you something you learned here. Not that America is perfect. We are not. But that there is another way to live. A way that does not demand death. A way that makes room for mercy." The prisoners listened in silence. Some nodded. Others wept. When Stevens finished, one of the prisoners stood. It was Takashi Yamada, the former sergeant. He bowed deeply. "Major Stevens," he said in careful English, "you gave us gift. But gift was not cookies. Gift was hope. We will not forget." The repatriation began in early 1946. Transport ships carried the prisoners back across the Pacific, back to the islands and cities they had left as soldiers and to which they returned as ghosts. Many found their homes destroyed, their families dead or scattered. They were treated with suspicion, sometimes with outright hostility. They were Horio, prisoners, tainted, dishonored. But they were also changed. In the decades that followed, these men became some of the most passionate advocates for peace, for reconciliation, for democracy. Hiroshi Nakamura became a teacher again, writing textbooks that challenged nationalist narratives. Takashi Yamada opened a bakery, specializing in American-style cookies, which he gave away to children every Christmas. Others became translators, diplomats, activists. They did not forget. They could not forget. The memory of that first Christmas, of the gifts under the tree, of the cookies wrapped in wax paper, it stayed with them. It was a seed planted in frozen ground, and against all odds, it had taken root. In 1985, a group of former Camp McCoy prisoners organized a reunion. They traveled to Wisconsin, now old men, their hair white, their bodies frail. They visited the camp, which had been decommissioned and turned into a training facility. The barracks where they had lived were gone. The mess hall where they had wept had been torn down. But they walked the grounds, remembering. And they planted a tree. A Japanese cherry, chosen for its beauty and its symbolism. A plaque was placed beside it, inscribed in both Japanese and English, in memory of the Christmas that changed us. In gratitude for the mercy we did not deserve. In hope that others may learn from what we learned, that even enemies can become brothers. The snow falls in silence. It is a different snow now, decades removed from that January evening in 1945, but it falls in the same place, on the same ground. The cherry tree, planted by old soldiers who had once been enemies, blooms every spring, its pale pink flowers a testament to transformation, to resilience, to the stubborn possibility of grace. What happened at Camp McCoy was not unique. Across America, in hundreds of camps, thousands of prisoners from Germany, from Italy, from Japan, underwent similar transformations. They encountered a nation that, for all its flaws, for all its contradictions, believed in something larger than itself. A nation that enshrined in its founding documents the radical notion that all men are created equal. A nation that, even in war, tried, imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely, to live by its principles. The prisoners had been taught that democracy was weakness, that individualism was chaos, that mercy was foolishness. And then they had experienced it. They had tasted it in cookies baked by strangers. They had felt it in the warmth of a heated barracks. They had seen it in the faces of guards who treated them not as subhuman, but as men. And that experience shattered their indoctrination more thoroughly than any bullet could have. It did not make them love America. Many remained critical, some remained bitter. But it made them question. It made them think. It planted in them the knowledge that another way of living was possible. This, perhaps, is the true legacy of those Christmas celebrations in the prisoner-of-war camps. Not that America was perfect. Not that the war was just. Not that suffering was redeemed. But that even in the midst of hatred and violence, even when every incentive pushed toward cruelty and dehumanization, human beings chose differently. They chose to bake cookies. They chose to string lights. They chose to give gifts to men they had every reason to despise. And that choice, that small, stubborn, irrational choice, changed the world. One prisoner at a time. One cookie at a time. One Christmas at a time. The last survivor of Camp McCoy's Compound 7, a man named Kenji Suzuki, died in 2018 at the age of 96. In his final interview, given to a Japanese documentary filmmaker, he spoke about the Christmas of 1945. "I do not know if there is a God," he said, his voice thin and wavering. "I do not know if there is a heaven. But I know this. On that night, when I held those cookies in my hands, when I tasted that sweetness, I felt something I had thought was lost forever. I felt human. I felt seen. I felt, for the first time in years, that my life had value." He paused, his eyes distant, looking at something the camera could not capture. "They did not have to do that," he whispered. "We were their enemies. We had killed their friends. And they gave us cookies. They gave us Christmas. They gave us ourselves back." He smiled, a small, sad smile. "I have spent 70 years trying to understand why. And I think I finally do. They did it because they could. Because they believed that even in darkness, even in war, there must be light. And they were right. The snow falls in silence. But beneath the snow, beneath the frozen ground, roots reach deep. And every spring, without fail, the cherry tree blooms. This is not a story about victory. It is not a story about defeat. It is a story about the quiet, persistent power of mercy. About the way a single act of unexpected kindness can crack open a heart that war has tried to harden. About the strange and fragile hope that, even after everything has been destroyed, something new might grow. The prisoners of Camp McCoy were not saved by Christmas. They were not converted, not in any simple sense. But they were changed. And in changing, they became witnesses to a truth that transcends nations and ideologies. That we are, all of us, more than what we have been told we are. That we are capable of more than we imagine. That even in our darkest moments, we can choose light. The cookies have long since been eaten. The gifts have long since worn out. The men who gave them and the men who received them are nearly all gone. But the memory remains. It remains in archives and diaries, in testimonies and photographs, in a cherry tree blooming on a hillside in Wisconsin. And it remains as a question, a challenge, an invitation. If mercy is possible between enemies, if kindness can flourish even in the soil of war, then what else might be possible? What other walls might we tear down? What other enemies might we embrace? What other Christmases might we give? The snow falls. The tree blooms. The story endures. And in its enduring, it whispers a truth as old as winter and as new as spring, that love, in the end, is stronger than hate, that generosity is more powerful than greed, that the smallest act of grace can echo across generations, changing not just individuals, but the very shape of history itself. This is the legacy of Christmas at Camp McCoy. This is the gift that keeps on giving. Not cookies, not soap, not socks, but the knowledge, hard-won, precious, undeniable, that another world is possible, that we can be better, that we must be better, and that somewhere, in the space between what we are and what we could be, mercy waits, patient, stubborn, eternal, ready to transform us, if only we have the courage to accept it.